All right, so I'm going to jump into my presentation and should have done it. How come it didn't do it? There we go. Okay, so what we're talking about is a series of dominoes. And hold on, I'll get going here. I got it. Okay. Sorry that I do this. I have to get rid of my bar. It's in my way. There we go. Okay, now I'm back. There we go. Okay, so my whole presentation is about this is where we are today. And it's not that this is the only stuff going on, but you'll recognize this. So we have social emotional learning, critical race theory, pornography in schools, people that can't figure out whether they're a boy or a girl, dirty old men in girls' bathrooms, same-sex marriage, fake news, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. And those last three, somebody might say, hey, what do those have to do with those other things? And I'm just going to say, I think it's all related, but I'm not going to really get into that. My point tonight is there's something that started all of this, and that's what we're going to discuss. So do you guys recognize these two characters?
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously that was a Hollywood script, but my point is if we could get in that DeLorean and go back in time, I'm saying if you could stop that first domino from falling, I don't know what this year would look like, but it would be different. And that's really kind of my point. Okay. So in your Zoom, do you have a piece of paper? Let's do it this way. Do you have a piece of paper that you can write something down?
Sure.
All right. So I want each of you to write down what you think the first domino might be.
Yeah.
And don't tell me yet. I'll ask for that later. But just take a wild guess. I'll give you 1 ounce of silver if you can guess it right. And I'll tell you, before July, I wouldn't have known how to answer this. So it's something I've learned recently. But think about it before we get going too much further. You got your answers down?
I don't know.
How many years? Give me how many years?
Yeah, how far back?
I'm not going to tell you that yet, okay? So I'll hold off on that. Okay, but I will tell you this. It happened before 1960.
Okay, I got it then.
Oh, you got it? Okay, so write something down. So 1960 begins with the pill. I didn't know that that was the year that contraceptive pills were introduced, but it was. Okay, now guess when the Beatles came to America.
64.
Wow, good job. Okay, guess when Woodstock was.
69.
Holy cow, how do you know this stuff? Okay, so do you have both of your answers written down before we go any further?
I don't still. I
Take a wild
I'm
guess.
clueless on
It's worth an ounce of silver, so you may as well guess.
that.
But I do want to say, I only want to give away 1 ounce. So if she gets it right,
And she'll probably get it then.
You're coasting in. Okay, so the point is, this is like bookends. I had to look this stuff up. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to answer like Diane did. But these are bookends to a decade that we would call the sexual revolution. And if you typed it in under Google or DuckDuckGo, it would say, Wikipedia would say the sexual revolution was really the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. But most of us think of the 60s as the decade when family values were really, on the assault, right? But it didn't start then. So it started in 1953. So Diane, let's see if you can get 4 answers right. What happened in 1953 that might have started the sexual revolution?
I was going to say it was 1948, Israel becomes a state.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So I don't know.
Okay, so
Goodness. You have.
Playboy magazine started in 1953. And I think if I would have, if somebody would have asked me the questions, I think I could have eventually gotten it right to think that, oh yeah, okay, it makes sense. Playboy magazine launched the decade of the 60s and then everything that happened since then. But what I didn't know until July is that Hugh Hefner says that asterisk is what gave him the idea to start Playboy magazine. And that asterisk is the domino that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to build some suspense. If your guess was Israel, that's not Israel. Okay.
No.
It's not related to the sexual revolution.
No. But he actually is quoted as saying of that asterisk, he says, I want to be the pamphleteer of that idea. Okay, so we're going to get to that. But we would think of these pictures as being kind of the social element of our timeline. And now I want to look at what the Supreme Court did during this time period. Okay, so this is where it gets kind of technical. I have friends who know the Supreme Court much better than I do, and they could identify, let's say, in the early 1800s, where the Supreme Court went off, we'll just say 1 degree, right? And so we'll just pick a date. I purposefully haven't looked up the date, but I know which court ruling they talked about. So let's just say it was 1830 or something like that. If you get off 1 degree from the Constitution in 1830, you could end up here in 21, being similar to where we are today, right? It doesn't take much of a deviation to start moving away from the Constitution. So my point with that is I recognize before the asterisk, there were other Supreme Court issues that factored into this. But it's very interesting that if we're talking about the asterisk and then the sexual revolution, there's some things here that tie in. And so prayer came out of schools with the Supreme Court ruling in 1962. Okay, so again, we have the sexual revolution starting in 1960. We have the whole idea of pornography starting in 53. And by 62, they get this brilliant idea, oh, hey, it's not constitutional. You shouldn't have prayer in schools. So the next one is taking the Bible out. So we'll give our quiz master here a guess. Do you know when the Bible came out of schools?
I'm thinking 65.
Close, 63.
No.
So it's just interesting to me. I gave this PowerPoint talk to one of our leaders in the movement, and she says, I remember, Brad, the day that we went to school and we no longer opened in prayer. And that was a shocking experience for that little girl at that time. And interestingly, she's a part of a leader of a prayer movement today. And when I heard that story, I said, wow, that's the seed that made, this a really big topic to you. Then, of course, in 73, we have Roe versus Wade, but the whole moral decline in my timeline didn't end in 73. In 2003, we had the Supreme Court rule against Texas and some other states that had sodomy laws. That meant then that, we'll just say homosexuals had rights to do whatever they wanted to do in public. And then we had 2 rulings back to back kind of in 2013 and 15 that led to where we are today, where we have same-sex marriage. So that's my moral decline, which again is kind of the focus of my timeline. So what we're talking about is, okay, so now I painted the picture, what's the domino, okay? But before we do that, I want us to think what it was like before that asterisk. So you're getting closer to knowing the time period. 1944, I'm going to just arbitrarily pick a date. I'll say June the 6th, 1944. That was D-Day. Okay, so let's say we go back in time and we land in this landing craft and we'll say a pep talk to these 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are about to hit the beach of Normandy. And our pep talk goes something like this. We say, guys, I want to let you know, when you get to that beach and that gate opens, there's about 75% of you that are going to get killed today. There's going to be machine gun fire and other stuff going on, and a whole bunch of you are going to get wiped out. But some of you, and I'm going to tell you in advance, you're actually going to win this war. And what you're fighting for today is not just the freedom of America, but in fact, it's for the entire world. And so because you do what you do today, those of you who make it, you're fighting so that your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will live in a free America. And someday they're going to have the freedom to look at this kind of a picture, and your great grandkids and grandkids are going to call every one of you a racist. Someday you're fighting so that we can have pornography in schools, that there will be the opportunity that your great grandkids can choose their sex without parental consent, make changes sexually, and for a freedom where boys won't know if they're boys or girls won't know if they're girls. And eventually we're going to have men marry men and women marry women. And we're going to teach kids in school that we were a nation formed by racists. And that's the freedom that we're fighting for. So go out there and get those Nazis. Okay. My point is, if those people in 1944 could have heard what it was like today, they would have no understanding of what we're talking about. They wouldn't think it's possible to be confused about what sex you are, or even to change your sex. It would make no sense. But to really nail this a little bit further, I want to talk about what it was like in 1944. So 1944, kids would have gone to school and it would have opened their day with prayer. They would have taken their right palm and put it over their heart and pledge allegiance to the flag. And in most school rooms, there would have been probably a framed poster of the 10 Commandments on the wall. And they would have learned through their history teaching that there were noble men who were not perfect, but were used by God to create America, which was kind of like God's gift to the world. In fact, it would represent, in the timeline of history and government, a 5,000-year leap, an experience that had never happened before, and an experiment that the founders weren't sure if it would work, but it would really represent the first time ever that the people were really in charge. That's what our Constitution was all about. They would have learned all of that. And in 1944, it's not that we still had, let me say it this way, we still had race issues that were yet to be dealt with. So we weren't a perfect world in 1944, but it wasn't the assumption that every white person was a racist. That was not what people thought about in 1944. So I'm just trying to find what life was like. And the further you go back in time towards 1776, the stronger some of those elements became. But then we have this asterisk, which is 1947. Okay, so before I tell you any more, I might possibly embarrass you here. What are the guesses that you each had? What was one of them, Diane, Israel?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, so obviously that's not it. And Brent, did you have a guess?
I did not.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I'm confident that you wouldn't have guessed it because I didn't know that I'm smarter, but I would have been completely clueless about this. Okay, so what is happening in 1947 is that there's one university in America where something happened. And I have no idea how many colleges and universities existed in 1947, but what I'm saying is there's one specific situation that happened that began a movement to cause you have to say, I want to be the pamphleteer of that movement. And a few years later, 6 years later, he started the magazine and built this pornographic empire. And just 7 years after starting the magazine, then, we launch into the sexual revolution and all this other stuff I'm saying that kind of happened. So this is the single domino. This is the first domino happening on a college campus. And now I have kind of like a quiz for you. Did it happen in California, New York, or we'll toss in Indiana, and don't answer that yet? Okay, those are the four choices, and there is going to be a right answer. But here's what I want us to process. Let's suppose I tell you what happened and you say, wow, I never knew that, but you're 100% right. It makes sense if the things we're dealing with today are the result of that domino, and you agree, and we can identify the campus and the state. My question is, should the people today of that state bear some kind of responsibility for what was started in 1947?
Yeah.
Okay. So then my question is, since it says timeline of America's moral decline, do you think that asterisk represents something that we might call secular or something that we might call spiritual? Spiritual aspect to this domino?
I'll say spiritual.
Okay.
I would have
So
said
now-
secular.
You would say the same? Okay. So now let's say that
I would have
we
said
agree-
secular.
Pardon?
I would have said secular.
Oh, you would have, oh, okay, okay. So let's, just for the sake of example, let's agree that it's spiritual, because obviously it's moral, right? So there's a connection between morality and what we would call spirituality, or however you say it. But my question is, if we were to agree that it's spiritual, that something happened at that asterisk on a campus that is spiritual, then can we say that the churches in that state bear some responsibility for this spiritual event that happened?
Yep.
Okay. So as I've thought about it, and you might be able to help me understand this better, but to me, it would seem like if we can put the dots together and agree that this is somehow a spiritual event that happened, the churches bear some responsibility, then the only two things I've thought of that are, maybe significant, maybe there's some other aspect that we might say isn't significant, but one would be that the church was aware of what was happening in 1947, and we would say they were engaged in a spiritual battle, and then they lost, and the result then is all the stuff that I said happened today. So that's, let's say, option A. Option B is this happens in 1947. It's a spiritual activity that's creating a moral decline. It's the first domino in a series of dominoes that lead us to where we are today. But the church of that state is completely unaware that this happened. And maybe it goes on for decades before they finally wake up and realize, oh my goodness, look what happened. So let's say those are the only two options, just for sake of example. One is they fight the battle and lose. The other is they don't even know there's a battle going on. And then someday they wake up and realize, oh shoot, we should have done something. Would you think one of those two choices maybe is worse in a sense than the other, or are they both kind of equal?
Well, if they know about it, then I would say it was worse.
Yeah. And it makes me think of Revelation chapter 13 at the end of the chapter. It's the church of Laodicea, and Jesus is saying, you guys are so apathetic and lukewarm that I just want to spew you out of my mouth. You know, I wish you'd either be hot or cold, but to not even know what's going on and to be apathetic really results in a very negative passage that we tend to look at. Okay, so you get the idea. I just want us to be able to connect the dots before we do this. So now you get to guess. It's one of these states. Which state do you think is most likely to have started this domino sequence?
California.
I would say California.
Okay. And would you know enough about California to pick a particular school?
I would guess Berkeley.
Exactly. Okay. So before I developed this PowerPoint, I was testing the idea in the quiz on my mom, who's 94. And of course, I'm from California, and I gave her the 4 states, and I said, Mom, which one do you think it is? She says, well, of course it would be California. And, and I said, well, what school are you thinking about? She said, UC Berkeley. And I would have answered the same way. But that's not the answer. Okay, so now, what do you think the answer is? If it's not California, which state do you think it might be?
Well, it's probably a trick question. It's probably going to be Indiana. Stupid the Hoosiers did.
So you're right, okay, but it's not New York. People have guessed New York because, hey, it seems like bad things happen on both coasts. Someone guessed Nevada. I would have guessed Nevada. That's where prostitution is legal, but it is Indiana, okay? So what I didn't really know, the whole story until July, is that this guy in this picture, his name is Alfred Kinsey. Have you ever?
I was going to say that. Kinsey,
right.
The Kinsey report.
There you go. You could have had announced as silver if you didn't think
that was going through my head the whole time we were talking about it. No, 47.
There you go.
Too far back, I thought it was the 50s.
So
Kinsey.
Alfred Kinsey comes to Indiana from New Jersey, and I'm not going to tell you all of the stuff that relates to this, but he sets up supposedly an institute named after himself, Kinsey Institute, and this research. And you're right, his first thing was called the Kinsey Report on sexuality. So there's a whole story about this, and if you want to know more, you can certainly learn it. That's not my point tonight. My point tonight is to help you understand that the sexual revolution started from Bloomington IU in 1947 on their campus through this institute being set up. It probably is, it should be of interest that Lilly Foundation helped fund it, and the Indiana Chamber of Commerce helped fund it, and the Rockefeller money,
and then Lilly made help.
Yeah, so it's not rocket science to say Rockefeller money is a bad source of funding, but there's a connection here with our 4th largest company in Indiana, plus the Chamber of Commerce as a statewide organization helping start the Kinsey Institute. Okay, so there's not going to be many people that I'm physically talking to, either online or in person, that was alive in 1947 or of an age to have made any difference in what was happening. Okay, but all of us are alive today. Everyone I'm going to talk to is alive today. And in 2016, the IU University encompassed Kinsey Institute. So before that, they were just using the facility. In 2016, they took them on as a part of the campus. And today, your money as tax dollars and my money is funding the Kinsey Institute. Okay. And this is what their homepage looks like. So the white section, of course, is a screenshot. And notice what it says underneath the name Kinsey Institute. It says Indiana University. And this is what they're presenting. Okay, now it's a lot darker and worse than this picture, but you get enough of the idea to know that this is an issue. Okay, so it's very accurate, I think, to say since 1947, Hoosiers have taught the world to reject God's laws. And if you're a Christ follower and this is important to you, this is the truth. And most people, like that movie character, and a lot of people can't handle the truth, but this is the truth. So, and certainly that Romans passage, is just a really bad passage that does reflect what we see today, not just in Kinsey Institute, but I mean, read the passage and that all the stuff we're dealing with in 2021 is pretty much described, we could say, as the foundation of what's happening in that passage. Okay, well, I'm going to make this really kind of personal to me. Of course, I'm from California. In my lifetime, our family has seen San Francisco become like this and worse, right? This is just the nudity of San Francisco. This kind of parade happens more than once a year. This is what it's like. My wife and I used to, in our 20s and 30s, we would go to California. We'd always go to San Francisco. We're about where we live, about an hour and a half. You can be downtown San Francisco. We don't even, it's been more than a decade since we've gone there. We just have no interest in going there anymore. And of course, if you watch the news, that it's one of those places that Trump had a particular word that started with an S, and the second word was an H. That represents San Francisco as well as many of our other cities like that. But I used to think, hey, here in Indiana, we're not as bad as they are. In fact, it was an emotional experience for me when I realized I had lived longer in Indiana than I had in California. Okay, but initially I wasn't happy about that. When I made that realization, it was just solidifying that I'm really happy to be a Hoosier. And this kind of thing I would look at and say, well, we're not as bad as them. And then if we went to Nevada, one state east, they have legalized prostitution. And I'm sure I've had the thoughts, well, we're not like them, we're not quite as bad as them. And then some of us have been involved in the whole abortion situation and know when this happened. This was New York. This is the Senate in 2019 actually celebrating that they passed a bill that would allow them to kill babies outside the womb. And when that happened, I doubt that I was the only one in Indiana that thought, well, we're not as bad as they are. That's pretty bad, right? And what I'm now realizing, as I've kind of processed all of this year, is that every one of those comparisons, I think God would say is sin, but it's worse than that. He would say, you don't even understand, you guys in Indiana started all of this. It's Indiana and the Kinsey Institute that resulted in all of the stuff I just put up there. And I'm going to show you that. But here's the abortion issue. And so similarly, we could say since 1973, Hoosiers have allowed babies to be murdered. And that sentence is accurate because under the picture, it says since 73, Hoosiers could have used the 10th Amendment to end this. Okay, we're eventually going to talk about that. But first, I want us to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. So this picture is actually several years old. This picture is when we would have said there's 60 million babies that have been killed in the womb. And that's the equivalent of taking out all of Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Missouri, and Iowa. So I did this presentation to one of our leaders that is an expert on this topic. And he said, Brad, if you could blacken Minnesota, you would take out another 5 million, which would bring it up to date. And I don't have the graphic ability to do that, but he's right. This has become bigger, but it's worse than that. The World Health Organization, WHO, estimates that there's 40 to 50 million abortions per year. That's about half the size of Fort Wayne every day. Okay. And then in my study of putting this together, I just stumbled across this report that I'm going to reference here in a second, but I'm just going to read you what I found. It says in 73, that the US Supreme Court justices relied heavily on Kinsey's data to rule in Roe versus Wade. So Kinsey reported his research as showing that abortion was quite common and safe among American women, and that any problems from abortion were the result of illegal abortions not being performed by doctors. Therefore, abortion should be legalized. Then the next sentence, this argument has since been used at the United Nations and abroad. So that's just validating what I'm trying to say from another source, actually. And when I looked at this, I don't know, 29-page report, the next paragraph said this, and I thought, hey, I should just leave that in there because this relates to what I said before. This says in 1957, Wolfenden report, a leading British study on homosexuality and prostitution, cited Kinsey for authority on decriminalization of sex crimes. Immediately after that, American homosexual advocates cited this report to justify loosening American laws of sodomy and homosexuality. The result was the legitimization, if I could say that, legalization and spread of homosexual behavior on both sides of the Atlantic. So this study would just be another validation that both legalized prostitution, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, deeper in the report, they would talk about gender confusion, all that kind of stuff stems from Bloomington campus in 1947. Now, as if that wasn't enough, one of the first people I showed this to was my client, who is 82. And when I said, guess which state, she immediately said, Indiana. I said, how did you pick that? And she said, well, my parents told me this would happen. And I said, where did your parents go to school? She said, one went to IU and the other went to Michigan. And she said, as a little girl, my parents told me someday we're going to be wrestling with homosexuality, same-sex marriage. And they said that's what's being taught in colleges. Okay, kind of crazy. So that's the domino that I think started what we're talking about, but now we need to kind of expose this. So this deals with a picture of our Constitution, and it asks the question, who will God hold accountable for 60 million murdered babies? So given this flow chart, what do you think the answer is?
Me.
Yeah, we the people, right? Now, I'm not like super smart, but I made this flow chart. And before a breakfast that I had in 2015, I think it was, there was a national author speaking in Warsaw that a friend of mine had put together a meeting. I saw the guy, thought he was, impressive. I said, hey, are you free for breakfast? I was surprised he said yes. So he helped me understand this. I went home and I made this flow chart. And before that, I had no idea exactly that it was this simple, right? But this leads to this question then, is Roe versus Wade a law of the land, or is it a legal opinion?
Legal opinion.
Exactly. I have people that have said it's the law of the land. In fact, I think that's the predominant view of people who don't understand the flow chart. So if we need to prove it's a legal opinion, you can go to the Supreme Court website and they say, these are our opinions. And you can click on the opinion and go deep enough and you'll find 1973 Roe versus Wade. What a legal opinion is simply their opinion about a particular case at a particular point in time. It doesn't create a law. So one of the leaders that I said this to said, wait a minute, you mean there wasn't something passed in Congress signed by the president to say abortion is legal? And the answer is no, there's never been, okay? And before we do that, I want to say this. This picture shows 5 states in orange out of 50. Those 5 states are the only states that are actually following federal laws related to marijuana. The other 45 states have followed the flow chart on the left. The other 45 states have said the 10th Amendment allows us to say, you can make a federal law, but we're going to decide we're not going to follow it. That's called the 10th Amendment. If DC Swamp is deciding a law that's not within the powers of the Constitution that's been offered to them, then the 45 states are saying, we actually have that constitutional right, not you. We're going to do marijuana the way we want to do it. We don't care what you say. Okay, which do you think is supposedly more powerful, a Supreme Court opinion or a federal law?
Federal law.
Exactly. So this picture is even more powerful than saying that we're going to use the Supreme Court we're going to use the 10th Amendment to tell the Supreme Court to go take a hike on your opinion. And what's really sad, if you think about it from a spiritual side, is that there's 45 states that have used their state rights to do what they want to do in violating a federal law, but there's not one state that has used the same 10th Amendment to stop abortion in their state. And to prove my point about Roe versus Wade being an opinion, this was a very significant month because, you know, this is the reaction to Texas, which did not end abortion. But Texas, of course, had a heartbeat bill. There's a couple other states that have heartbeat bills, but theirs kind of went deeper and broader and created this kind of frustration. So Pelosi is saying, we got to codify abortion as a law so that it will be the law of the land. Okay, now I'm going to tell you, I don't know how much experience you have, but the majority of Christians that follow the pro-life movement think that Roe versus Wade is the law of the land. And it's not too difficult to go to some famous website of a famous organization that leads that movement and realize that people from that movement are calling it the law of the land. And in fact, they're waiting for the Supreme Court to change so that they can give a different opinion that would end abortion. That's their strategy, okay? But here's another article that came out here in September where Biden says, we need to make this the law of the land. Both people, both articles, Pelosi, and in this case, Biden, are emphasizing that we got to do everything we can to try to pass a law because the state of Texas and other states are not following the Supreme Court opinion. So let's make it a law. And I'm saying, even if it was a law, it still isn't constitutional. You could use the 10th Amendment to say, we're not going to do that anymore. Okay?
Okay.
If you haven't figured it out, the GOP, the grand old party, the Republican Party, is not going to save us. Actually a part of the problem. They're not a part of the solution. And in the background there are not necessarily all these sins. Some of them are, but it's certainly things that we're wrestling with that, quite frankly, the GOP is an obstacle. So I told you today, this week, there was an opportunity for the Republican supermajority in our state to say, let's stop mandatory vaccines. There were only 2 people that supported that out of 100. So the biggest obstacles that we'll just call the liberty movement has had in this last legislative session has not been from Democrats. It's been from the GOP supermajority. And if you have an interest in that, I'm going to show you where you can read 5 pages of that kind of legislative activity, and you'll quickly understand that the GOP was the obstacle. Okay, so this then is just another demonstration of that. IC 1634-2-1.1 is a law in the Indiana books. And it essentially says life begins at conception. So now, and this is the hardest question of all. Guess when that became law?
I'm gonna guess it came law in the 1990s.
Well,
Right.
interestingly, the code was established in 1995, but it was actually 10 years ago when the language was worded the way you see it right here. And before that, it didn't say this. So really, in 2011, there was an amendment to the 1995 law, which then essentially said life begins at conception. So in the last 10 years, more than 50% of the time, I didn't look it up, but it has to be more like 80% of the time or something. In Indiana, we've had a supermajority, meaning the governor's a Republican, the House is a Republican House, and the Senate is a Republican Senate. So we call that a supermajority. So if the supermajority wanted to pass a law, they have the ability to do that in spite of the Democrats. But in the last 10 years, what the supermajority has done since this law became law is they twisted other laws to justify the fact that they're breaking this law. So in other words, you can't kill babies according to this law, but you can if you make amendments to other laws to allow abortion to happen. And that's essentially what the supermajority has done. So this whole talk is not so much my opportunity to beat up the Republicans. I'm just trying to speak truth and say that we've been in the driver's seat. I believe God's going to hold us accountable for the fact that we've had a constitution that in 1973 could have said, we don't care what the Supreme Court opinion is. We're not going to do that in our state. And then for the last 10 years, we've been justifying that, well, yeah, we have that statement, but that doesn't mean that we can't kill babies, right? So I'm back to Revelations chapter 3. I think there's a problem there. And so if the GOP won't save us, that's why you've heard me talk about this. I think the answer is God. And I think we know enough to say that it begins with repentance. And here's what I want you to picture is that in that state house are a lot of people in suits that think very highly of Indiana University and are very proud of the fact that they represent our state well. And then they're very proud of the fact that Eli Lilly is in the heart of Indianapolis, being now our 4th largest company in the state. And they're very proud of the fact that, I'm going to say it a way they wouldn't, but that the Chamber of Commerce essentially pulls their strings and our legislative group is really dominated by what the Chamber of Commerce wants to do. Okay, so I'm thinking there's a need for repentance. And I can't play God. I'm not trying to judge people, but I'm just trying to say, I think if we're so clueless that what we hold up highly is what God is looking at, saying that's a huge problem. And now I miss saying something that I think is important. I showed this to one of my friends and leaders, and his reaction was, Brad, think about this. If this is a spiritual battle and you're Satan, to start that Kinsey Institute in let's say UC Berkeley, or I don't know, New York University, those would be the obvious locations, right? It's almost like a stealth coming into the middle of the Bible Belt in a cornfield and planting that first domino that then creates the series of everything we've seen. And I don't know anybody that thinks that the Church of Jesus Christ in Indiana has been actively involved in fighting the spiritual battle of what has been created on the Bloomington campus. And I see that as a huge problem. So this is just my personal opinion, not a pastor, I haven't been to seminary, but to me, it makes sense to think that if we want to see change in our state, we need to agree with God as to what our problems are. Okay, so that's what this is about. But I'm actually going to change this slide or add another one, because it's one thing to just, put on ashes and sackcloth and repent. It's another thing to then say, what are we going to do? So you already know that what we're going to do is have a transition on this day from praise, prayer, and repentance to then shifting to say, we need to take some action. And the two primary things that we're going to focus on this day is going to be a bill in 2020 that will end medical mandates, and then also a bill in 2022 that will take pornography out of school libraries. And I'm not going to get into that other than it exists. And if you think it doesn't, you need to be educated. That's not the point of my thing. So I'm just really ready to wrap up. And my point is, first of all, nobody should say, oh yeah, wow, you're right, we need to repent. Let's do that on November 16th. If you're a Hoosier, like I'm a Hoosier, we need to repent when God shows us we need to repent. The purpose of this is just to have the public display, the corporate kind of acknowledgement that we have a problem and we're responsible for this stuff. Okay, so that's what that's about. And hopefully most people that come to that will have some knowledge of this ahead of time. And then likewise, you don't wait until November to say, what should we do? So that's what we've been talking about. This is just one of the organizations that you can get tied into. And I learned everything I'm saying about Kinsey Institute from these people. It's called Purple for Parents. They were here in Warsaw teaching a course in July. And president of the organization is one of my friends. I kind of knew some stuff was bad about Kinsey, but I didn't know everything. And I couldn't have put this together if I hadn't gone there. So I'm suggesting anyone that, hasn't been to this, you don't have to have kids in school. You don't even have to have children. This is a really important thing to understand. And it goes much, much deeper than what I've described. I'm just trying to point people towards that. On the right corner, it says 19 steps for taking back Indiana. I'm going to show you on the next slide how you can get that. Maybe you have it from me, but there's a whole bunch of hyperlinks. One of them goes to Purple for Parents. So one of them goes to what we just showed, Indiana Patriots Alliance. So to get that, before I show that, here's another thing. Church at Planned Parenthood. I've been to one of these. I wish I would go more. But once a month in Indianapolis, they do a similar thing in South Bend. They actually have a Saturday church service at Planned Parenthood. It's kind of a cool idea. And it's a easy entry point to stand at the gates of hell, which when they do it in Indianapolis, it is the killing day. And they know when that happens and they plan their church service around it. And it's not some kind of a rowdy thing. It's actually worship and preaching and praying. And it's a really good thing to do. So that's just another opportunity. And if you get the article, 19 Steps for Taking Back Indiana, there's actually going to be about 4 different ways to get involved in this topic. I'm just highlighting one. And this is how you get it. So have you guys seen this before?
No,
No,
Okay, so you might want to write this down. You can text the two words, never again, to 260-693-7334. And you'll get a bounce back that will then send you to a link where if you want to get plugged in and know more about this kind of stuff, you can get on a mailing list. But if you don't want to do that, you can just scroll down and you'll see this article, 19 Steps for Taking Back Indiana. And if you click on that, then you're going to have 19 steps, and we're not asking you to do 19 things. We're just saying, hey, maybe pick 2 or 3 of these things. And there's over 20 hyperlinks that will take you to different areas of interest depending what your interest is. So that's kind of what that's about. And I'm done. So I thank you for your time. And now just give me some feedback.
so Brad, that was very enlightening. Are you doing this at any churches? This presentation?
Well, I've actually given this presentation to a couple other leaders, and I anticipate giving it to several pastors that, might be interested. So I can see that happening. I'm not sure that I'm going to make a big effort to go to different churches to do it, but I think there's the capability of different people who might modify this presentation, whatever fits them well. And the point is, Purple for Parents have reached thousands of Hoosiers with this message. It's just that what I've done is try to consolidate it because I spent 3 hours in training to learn stuff, and I've tried to package it in a way that, can reach more people in a sense. But you're exactly right. This is something that churches need to see and deal with. And really,
Yeah,
quite
we're gonna
frankly,
get it.
yeah, so here's maybe one other thing I could tell you. We've been talking about this, whether it's today or other times. On November the 16th, we have 2 main bills that we see as action points. One relates to ending medical mandates, and the other is taking pornography out of schools. Now there's going to be gobs of bills that we're interested in, but we just think our single focus is rallying people for those 2 bills. I think I told you this today, but there's 2 Facebook pages that I looked at related to those 2 bills, and there's many more than 2, but those 2 Facebook pages have 14,000 followers. And that doesn't necessarily mean 1,000 different people, but the point is there are thousands of people that are going to have the invitation to come to November, and we're praying for at least 2,000, and that would make a really critical mass statement, because on that date is called Organization Day. So it's the next time that both the House and the Senate will be together on that day, and they will have stuff they're doing in the afternoon. They'll be there in the morning for the most part, and we think we can make a powerful statement that we're serious about the next election, which is coming up in May, and we're looking for people to vote certain ways if they want to be reelected. And if they don't want to be reelected, well, then just keep voting the way you've been voting, because we know who you are. I mean, that's the kind of thing we're looking at.
Who were the 2 that didn't vote for it?
Yeah, it's Kurt Knisley, which I think I don't know if he's in your district or not where you live, but where I live.
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, so Kurt Knisley, and the other one is called John Jacob, and he's in District 93. Now today they voted on those maps. I haven't seen the maps for both men. They're still living where they live. They're still in District 22 and 93, but the structure of that looks a little bit different. I'm still in District 22. You probably are too. It's the top part towards Elkhart that got cut off, at least before the vote today. I don't know how it ended up And then his district in 22 has gone down into Wabash. So I'm not sure how that's all working out, but those are the two.
Okay,
All right.
interesting.
Any other
Yeah.
questions?
No, you just blew my mind though.
Yeah.
It was mind blowing for
And
me.
I don't doubt it.
And really, it's
I
not,
don't doubt it.
you know, I didn't think of all this stuff. All what I did was I got blown away when I heard it. And I tried to connect the dots, and I tried to put the timeline together in a way that other people, you know, can embrace what we're talking about. And then quite frankly, I had to go to the smart people to say, hey, am I doing it right? You know, is this the right story? And yeah, now here's one more interesting point for you. I did this live, which obviously we're live, but I did it in a presentation to about 25 people in Cedar Lake, which is by Crown Point area, and offered an ounce of silver, and one guy got it. Okay. And I was told that this group of 25 people were super informed, and they couldn't understand why I wanted to do this because they knew everything. Okay. And there was one guy who got the answer right, and he didn't want to take my coin, and I made him take it. But his story was in the early 70s, he studied, he called it studied at the Kinsey Institute. And part of it and knew what was going on. And that was before he became a Christian. And interestingly, his story is he felt so dirty and unfulfilled by the whole free love aspect that eventually led him to search out the Bible and Christ and take a whole different direction in his life. But the point is, he only knew the answer because he had lived it, and he was there on the campus. That's, yeah. So anyway, okay, that's my talk, and I appreciate your interest. And so we'll talk.
Well, we'll start praying and repenting.
There you go. Okay. Have a good evening. Thanks.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Okay, goodbye.
Good night.
Good night.
That's wild.